was once driving home on a Friday night after hanging out with some friends. I hadn't been drinking heavily, only 1 or 2 glasses of wine, but I was tired from a long work week and just wanted to crawl into my bed and enjoy a stress-free weekend. It was around midnight when I left the restaurant and headed back home. The city was still awake, but I hit the small patch of highway where traffic was light. Suddenly, I saw police lights in my rearview mirror. I cursed as I pulled over and racked my brain as to why I was being stopped. I figured that maybe the cop had seen me swerve around some potholes and was worried that I might be drunk. I pulled over and, to my surprise, the officer didn't stop, but slowly drove his car alongside mine. I rolled down my window and he made a motion for me to follow him. I wasn't sure at first if I had read him right, but he idled ahead of me as I began to drive my car back onto the highway. Once he saw that I was ready to follow, he started to drive. We drove for a while and I missed my turnoff as I tailed behind him. I wondered if perhaps I was driving a car similar to a wanted criminal and he was leading me to the police station. But that didn't make any sense. He could have just questioned me when I pulled over, or maybe something dangerous had happened on the highway and he was trying to direct me away from it. But if that was the case, he could have just told me to take a different route. No matter what theory I came up with, I couldn't justify why a police officer would ask me to follow him. He led me off onto a dirt road, and I trailed him as we drove through a thick field of brush and weeds. Finally, we came to an old abandoned way station. It was dark, and the confusion that I had felt before was now beginning to turn into fear. He turned off his car and I saw him get out. I could see him clearly as he stood in my headlights. He was thin, tall, and by his face he looked like he was either in his late 40s or early 50s. His hair was still dark, though, and I noticed that he kept his face slightly down as he headed toward my car. As he approached, I rolled down my window. I asked him if there was a problem, and he told me to turn off my car. When he said that, I felt an electric shock travel through me. But as I stared at his badge and gun, I turned off my engine. As soon as my headlights were off, he pulled out his flashlight. Then he asked me for my license and registration. He studied it as I waited for an explanation as to not only why had he pulled me over, but why had he asked me to drive out to a way station. After what felt like forever, he turned his attention back to me. I thought he might go back to his car and run my license number, but he didn't. He just stared at me. "Is everything in order?" I asked. "We'll see," he replied. Briefly, he lowered his flashlight, and I got another good look at his face. He was an average-looking guy. He stepped away from my window, and I thought he was going to walk back to his car and run my ID. Instead, he circled over to the passenger side door. To my horror, I watched as he opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. He shined his flashlight into my eyes again. I was blinded, and when I tried to turn my head, he moved his light along my field of vision. My heart was pounding, and I realized that I was shaking uncontrollably. He smelled like old coffee and sweat. I wanted to question him, to demand why he had asked me to follow him out to the middle of nowhere, but I felt like my vocal cords had shut down. I heard him lick his lips. "Do you know how fast you were going?" Was he pulling me over for speeding? I nodded, and he asked me another question about whether or not I had been drinking. I was barely able to tell him that I'd only had some wine. I figured he might give me a breathalyzer, but strangely he didn't seem to care about that. "Are you married?" he asked. I shook my head. "Boyfriend?" My stomach squeezed when he asked me that. I felt like I might throw up. I had just started seeing someone, but our relationship was new. I nodded because I didn't want this cop to think I was single, but I hesitated, and the officer noticed. "What?" he questioned. "Is it not serious?" I froze. I didn't know what to tell him. "Let me put it this way," he continued. "Are you two having sex?" My stomach did another somersault. That wasn't any of his business. Again, I froze. I didn't want to tell him about my sex life. He asked me if I enjoyed having sex. He asked me if I was faithful in my relationships. When I didn't answer him, he grew upset. "Look," he snapped. "I'll arrest you for refusing to cooperate with a police officer." Another blast of fear rushed through me, and I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. I mumbled that I would answer his questions. He then started to ask me about my sexual preferences. He asked me if I masturbated, watched pornography, or gave oral sex. He asked if I ever experimented with other women. He asked what my favorite position was and if I had ever had sex in a public place. I'll spare you the details, but I answered his questions. I sat there, utterly humiliated. Finally, he leaned in slightly and asked, "Have you ever fantasized about being raped?" When he asked me that question, my brain went into survival mode, and I started to wonder if I could run back to the highway and hide somewhere in the thicket. Where had I seen the last gas station, or could I fight this guy off? What would happen if he arrested me for refusing to answer any more of his questions? The officer seemed to notice my fight or flight reaction because he reached out and grasped my arm hard. "Take it easy," he told me. As he grabbed my arm, the light disappeared from my eyes as he put his flashlight in the cup holder. I could see his face again. I could also see that his free hand was moving to the front of his waist. I heard the clinking of his belt buckle. By now I was panicking, and as I was about to wrench my arm free, undo my seatbelt, and jump out of my car, I saw 2 headlights pass by. For a brief moment I saw the look on the officer's face. It was a mix between panic and frustration. We both watched as the 2 headlights turned into a pickup truck and began to do donuts in the lot. A bunch of teenagers were in the back, hollering and laughing. They didn't seem to notice the cop car. Sighing, the cop let go of my arm. He seemed to squirm for a moment, and then he handed me my license and registration that he had stuffed into his breast pocket. "Just slow it down out there," he said quickly, as though he were letting me off with a warning, before snatching his flashlight and exiting my car. I watched as he walked toward the pickup truck and hollered at the teenagers to beat it. I started my car and got out of there. I was still shaking when I got home. Immediately I called my mom, and she told me to file a complaint. But I was still too shaken up. What if they didn't take it seriously? What if that officer found out? He saw my license and he knew where I lived. He knew the make and model of my car. Besides, it had been dark, and with him flashing his light in my eyes, I wasn't able to look at his badge or find out his name. After a few days, I had decided to let it go and pretend that it never happened. As the weeks went by, I started to feel better. The guy I had been seeing was furious and insisted that he drive me home on the nights that I hung out with my friends. But over time, we both became less paranoid. However, about 4 months later, a woman turned up dead in the field near my incident with the police officer. To make matters worse, her abandoned car was found at that exact same way station. And to my surprise, a highway patrolman was featured on the local news, giving tips for female drivers on how to stay safe if they break down on the side of the road. When I watched that segment, I was shocked to see that the featured highway patrolman was the same officer who had pulled me over. Needless to say, I filed a complaint.